So I'd like to introduce Adam Hodge, who is our guest speaker. He is the head of reference for the Kansas Historical Society, and he is brought to us by a pretty generous grant out of the, I'm trying to remember, what do they call that? Humanities, Kansas Humanities. So this should be a good presentation. If you ever wondered, well, we kind of know what was going on in the 1770s on the East Coast, but do you ever wonder what was going on here in 1775, 1776? Well, Adam knows, and he's now going to share that with us. Adam? All right. Dr. Adam Hodge.
All right, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to try to keep my eye on the clock here. As I was telling folks at the table earlier, this is something I could talk about for more than an hour. Nobody wants that, at least right now. I know there's other business, so I'm going to try to keep myself on schedule here. So yes, my name is Adam Hodge. I work at the Kansas State Historical Society. I work specifically in the state archives and the reference department, helping people do research. Oftentimes it's genealogy, so people can, get memberships to various organizations and whatnot for which they have to prove their lineage. So what y'all had to do to get to where you're at right now, I've helped people get there. So it's fun to see sort of, to some degree, the end product of that. So my research interests are broadly environmental history. I have a book coming out later in the year that focuses on the history of fish and fisheries in Montana, of all places, and that kind of hints at the fact that I've only lived in Kansas for a few years. I am an environmental historian by training, so my colleagues at the Historical Society, specifically in the museum, approached me when they're like, hey, we need to put together an exhibit space, 9,000 square feet, for Kansas 1776. What are we going to put in there? And so, because obviously it's a challenging task, but a fun one, illuminating a largely overlooked portion of Kansas history. Most histories of Kansas tend to begin in 1854, when a lot of that good stuff happens in the Bleeding Kansas period. A lot of books kind of, in a chapter or less, get us up to 1854, and now let's get to the free staters and the slave state folks fighting over things. So the whole point of Kansas 1776 is to bring some attention to what happened well before the 1850s. And so the goal here is really to try to immerse us in the world of Kansas circa 1776. So Kansas has changed a lot environmentally and culturally since 1776. So we have to try to picture a world without cattle, a world without wheat, a world without honeybees here in Kansas. None of those things were here in 1776. But the interesting thing is that Kansas changed a lot before 1776 as well. There's considerable environmental change as a result of natural processes and human activities alike. And so I kind of want to dip our toes in that today. So if we could have the next slide, please. All right, so I framed the presentation around 4 basic questions. The first is, what was Kansas like in 1776? After all, the presentation is Kansas 1776, so we've got to devote a little bit of attention to that. The next is who and what lived in Kansas circa 1776? What changes did it experience before 1776? And what changes has it experienced since? So before and since, what changes have we had? So that's just kind of a brief overview of what's going to follow here. And you're doing fantastic, Vernon. Thank you. So first thing to talk about is climate. Kind of get a feel for what was going on in Kansas in 1776. What did it feel like? So there have been a lot of just considerable fluctuations in climate conditions in Kansas both long-term and short-term throughout the region's history. In short, cycles of hot and warm weather, hot and dry weather, and then cooler and wetter weather. Cycles of relative for what for us would be drought conditions, but then wetter, cooler periods as well. So we go to the Pleistocene epoch, which was about 12, 13, 14,000 years ago. This was the last great ice age. Northeastern Kansas was covered in ice. Megafauna, such as mastodons, giant bison, mammoths, saber-toothed cats. These were the things in Kansas. And I'm fine that those things are gone now. They're extinct, it's sad, but I don't want to contend with that world. They're long gone. So the Pleistocene is followed by the Holocene epoch. This is the current geological age that began about 11,000 years ago. Generally warmer and drier than the Pleistocene. Even within that, though, there have been fluctuations in climate, shorter term trends. There was, for instance, the medieval warming period of about 900 to 1300. This was a period of extended drought. It was very hard on grasslands and grazers. And we're talking about the smaller wildlife, if you will, that remained after the Pleistocene. The smaller wildlife, like bison and elk. Again, small is relative compared to the giant bison and the mastodons and whatnot that were here during the Pleistocene. So the medieval warming period wraps up about 1300, and then we move on to the Little Ice Age. This, as the name suggests, it is a cooler and wetter period of history for this region. It lasts from about 1300 to 1850. So now I kind of started, super early, and I had, when's he going to get to 1776? Why is he starting with the last ice age? I had a U.S. survey professor, when I was a TA, when I was a grad student, who started with the Big Bang. So it's like, I move things along a little bit quicker than that. So the Little Ice Age, cooler and wetter in Kansas, which is in short good for the grasslands and its grazers. So it is generally, when we talk about the Little Ice Age, very hospitable climate for those that lived in the region. So climatologists offer insight into the last 2,000 years via ice core studies and tree rings. It might sound like the most boring thing ever, but tree rings are, in some cases, the only window into what the climate was like at a given point in time. So one of the great tools that we have out here, and I have it linked here, which if anybody wants to get out and play around on the site, it's, again, more interesting than one thinks. It's kind of like, some folks get sucked into the YouTube and other, video rabbit holes of watching these things, maybe on Facebook. And I guess being a nerd, I get stuck in going through these past climate reconstructions. Oh, what was it like this year? So this is University of Memphis has a great map sequence that goes from year 0 up to, I want to say it's maybe 1980 or so. They might have brought it up to more recent. But using tree rings, ice cores, things like that, you could pick a given year and it gives you the relative wetness or dryness of that year. And so we see here 1776, Kansas, it's relatively wet. And it is kind of right in the middle of a relatively wet stretch of about 4 or 5 years. Bookended, though, you see relatively dry years in 1773 and 1780. It swings more towards a drying trend. And so what's called the Palmer Drought Severity Index can be really insightful. And the fascinating thing is, in some of my prior research, where I've been able to pair this with historical documents, such as John C. Fremont and some others who are commenting, oh, there's a drought going on, when he's heading, west through Wyoming in the 1840s. And I paired it with PDSI, and it's spot on. It was a dry year at that time. So it's interesting to put this, in some cases, side by side with the historical record. So one of the things we notice as we go through this is there were relatively few what we would call average years. most years in Kansas, and I think we, in a lot of cases, see this today, it tends to be either relatively wet or relatively dry. The mean is pretty elusive, and this was the case back at this time. So, the grasslands. So, you can't talk about Kansas without talking about grasslands. So, soil is a key to plant growth, supporting grazers, and then, by extension, their predators. Kansas, if we ever wanted to brag to our out-of-state friends, maybe in Nebraska or something like that, Kansas has more acres of prairie-type soils than any other state. Yeah, you can keep your football, you can keep your whatever. It's about prairie soil. Kansas has more than any other state. So, Kansas, I did not realize this until I started research on this, has a state soil. I guess a lot of states do. Just not something you think about. But in Kansas, it is Harney silt loam, the official state soil, covers much of 26 west central Kansas counties. So we talk about prairies that grow, the grass that grows on this soil. So this map up here gives a nice little snapshot of, in the east, got tall grass prairies, more than 150 species of grasses, and 300 species of wildflowers. And those are a lot of the kind of classic, if you will, tall grass species: big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem. In the west, and what's shaded in yellow there, are your short grass prairies. Shorter, hardier grasses, blue grama, buffalo grasses. These are plants suited to drier conditions. These are the grasses of the high plains. In between, you have what's kind of shaded in orangish here, mixed grass prairies. And as the name suggests, the composition is a bit of a mix between tall grass and short grass. And what it looks like on, you look at it in the span of 5 years, a decade, whatever, there's a little bit of a seesaw where if it's relatively wet, the taller grasses tend to predominate. If it's drier stretch of period, the shorter grasses tend to do better, while the tall grasses kind of retreat a little bit. So, can't talk about plants in Kansas without the sunflower. Native Americans actively cultivated sunflowers. A lot of uses, whether it was for food and soups, dyes for garments, for various materials, oil. Apparently, one of the things is women using sunflower oil for their hair as a sort of conditioning type material. Medicines. Apparently, sunflower is diverse, whether it's the leaves or whatnot, for a whole number of maladies, from kidney ailments to being used on open wounds, things like that. Native Americans very adept at finding those uses. Sunflowers, we know, will be adopted as the state flower in 1903, but it had importance long, long before that. Big blue stem, got to get big blue stem, its flowers, no pun intended. Tall grass that could surpass 6 feet, dominated areas such as this in eastern Kansas, also known as turkey foot because of how it kind of branched out at its tops. Very, very important to grazers. So the grasslands, continuing. Indigenous homes in Kansas circa 1776, we tend to think of, teepees, we tend to think of the mobile housing units. But kind of the norm for a lot of the cultures that were here in Kansas at the time, we're talking about the Kaw, the Pawnee, it was the earth lodge, such as these. These were built and maintained by women. They had wooden frames covered with sod and clay. There were beds that ring the inside of the lodge, storage pits, sporadically to stash, dried foods, various goods. A hole at the top center to let out smoke and to let in sunlight. So these earth lodges are a little bit larger than we might think. They could comfortably hold up to 40 occupants in some cases. It would be extended family units living in these. Household with 3 other individuals. Me personally, I'm good. I mean, I imagine you wouldn't be in there, cooped up a lot. But my goodness, thinking of sharing a lodge that is largely open space, open concept before that became a cool thing. 39 other people, no thank you. But they did it. They did it. Better people than I am. So a good example here in Kansas is the Republican Band Pawnee Village near Republic, Kansas. In about 1776, if you went there, it would have consisted of about 40 lodges, estimated 1,000 people or so. For the Great Plains, certainly at that time, that was their city before there was a Topeka or a Wichita or whatever the case would be. People, I guess, would be saying, we're going to the Republican Pawnee Village for the weekend. Maybe not. All right, so they did use a lot of the cultures that visited the region, that lived in the area. These were their more permanent housing, but during their seasonal bison hunts, they would use teepees when they left these for maybe a few weeks, maybe a month or so, and then return to them. And again, women would be the ones who did that work and maintained those. They used fire to manage grasslands. So this, the flurry of the springtime fires that we're having here and have another little cycle in the fall. This is something that happened in Kansas, 1776. The Native Americans knew. A key to preserving stretches of grassland was burning it periodically to push back invading, shrubs, trees, to keep it grass. But also they realized, like we do today, it returns nutrients to soil and fuels rich grass growth. So Kansas grasslands begin to certainly change. After 1776, you have the Timber Culture Act in 1873. Kind of a nice little spin-off from the Homestead Act. People will get 160 acres for improving the land. And in the case of the Timber Culture Act, that meant planting trees on their property. The interesting thing in the Timber Culture Act, if you're not super familiar with it, it was fundamentally, on a large scale, an attempt to change the climate. They believed that one of the key differences between the eastern United States, where there were tons of trees and a more temperate climate, and you move to the west, there's fewer trees in a generally drier climate, was, well, let's plant more trees. It'll change the climate. So places like Wisconsin and more the upper Midwest, if you will, did participate more heavily than places like Kansas in the Timber Culture Act. But a result of the Timber Culture Act is trees popping up in more places where they weren't in 1776. That time, especially the further west you got in Kansas, trees were largely limited to along streams, along rivers. And you would, get up on the crest of a ridge and, or a hill, you would look ways, and it would be mostly grass, mostly wildflowers, trees along a stream bottom. The Timber Culture Act changes that, where you got trees being brought in from the east, oaks and things like that, and they're spread, and pines as well, creating windbreaks, establishing orchards, things like that. But certainly up to that point, it was primarily a grasslands. We're going to go ahead and skip to the next slide. So, just in the interest of time. So, the Kansans of 1776, it was a fluid cultural landscape. And the interesting thing is that before 1776, after, and then even before we get to the 1850s and we got, the Kansas Territory and then statehood, so many indigenous cultures came and went from Kansas before it was a state. One of the key developments here was the reintroduction of the horse to the American West during the 1600s and into the 1700s. There had been horses in North America during the time of the Pleistocene, like the megafauna, that again I'm glad are not here, they went extinct. And so it would be the Spanish, after they arrive in Central America and then push northward, they would reintroduce horses. These are smaller, hardier Spanish barbs that would be pretty well suited to the Great Plains region. This, of course, when Native Americans began integrating them into their cultures, greater mobility, increased use of the arid plains, where one of the biggest limiting factors in 1776 is getting from one water supply to another. And especially you start talking about the summer months, the fall months, when there's a lot of intermittent streams that go dry, getting to the next water source was key. And so horses helped with that. But of course there was work, there was adaptation involved with that, because you're adding a grazer to your culture. You are adding something to take care of. And so there was a little bit of a learning curve when Native American cultures adopted horses. We do know that in 1776, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kaw, Kiowa, Osage, Pawnee, and Wichita inhabited or either inhabited or visited parts of Kansas. So it was a combination of migratory and semi-sedentary cultures, where some, such as the Comanche, they were highly migratory. They might set up camp in a place for a week or two, pick up and move on. Part of that was a product of horse culture. You could not remain in one area for too long. The area would be grazed out, then you got to move on. Then there were certainly, as we talked about a little bit before with the Republican band, Pawnee Village, the more semi-sedentary cultures that would have for years on end a primary camp, typically along a river or a creek somewhere, where they would have timber, they would have water, and certainly shelter, especially during the winter. A little bit of a break from the wind and the cold. So there were some temporary inhabitants in Kansas, cultures that literally arrived and almost as quickly left. The Modoc from California and the Shawnee from the eastern woodlands. So the Modoc was an interesting one to me when that came across my desk. We were getting visitors as part of a, what was it? It was a NAGPRA summit at the Historical Society. And one of the research guides that I was preparing, they requested Modoc. I'm like, what the heck, Modoc? That's California culture. They literally, I don't know how many years after they fought the U.S. Army in California, were removed to Kansas and then subsequently relocated out of the state. So little more than a pit stop from some cultures. The interesting thing is that the resident tribes of Kansas today, the four of them, the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, the Kickapoo tribe in Kansas, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. Got my breath now. They were all originally from the Great Lakes region. So all of the four resident tribes were not here in 1776. They would be pushed here during the age of Indian removal, live here for a few decades, and then be subsequently they stayed here, while others, those historically associated with Kansas before them, have been removed. So all of the tribes associated with Kansas circa 1776 have been removed from the state. We know that there were very few non-Native Americans, non-Indians in Kansas in 1776. We know that Coronado got to somewhere in central Kansas in 1541, searching for those 7 cities of gold that turned out to probably be Wichita huts gleaming in the sun in the distance. Knowing much about Coronado, not a nice dude. I have a hard time feeling bad for him, seeing his heart break, when he sees those 7 cities of gold actually be these, these earth lodges, and it's just dried grass glinting in the sun. No riches here, man. So, Spanish claimed Kansas on paper in 1776. It had the interesting thing is paper possession versus who was actually here. I mentioned all the indigenous cultures who were actually here, probably unaware of the fact that across an ocean, Spain was like, mine. So the region that includes Kansas had been claimed by the French until 1763. With the French defeat in the 7 Years' War, that territory became Spanish territory until 1801. Then for a whole 2 years, the French get it back until 1803, and then as we know very well, especially in this part of Kansas, it's part of the Louisiana Purchase, and then we soon have Lewis and Clark pass through the areas. But during the late 1700s, certainly there were fur traders venturing up the Missouri River from St. Louis, passing into Kansas, typically going up waterways such as the Kaw River in search of beaver, or if they previously established connections with local natives seeking to trade those after the natives had harvested them. We do know that in this very area there was Fort Cavignon, the first known European settlement in Kansas, somewhere near Leavenworth, abandoned in 1763, although people continue to periodically say, "We found it." I think there was recently another one of those. It's still not archaeologically documented, or at least recognized by the state of Kansas. Saying that as an independent historian, not as a Kansas State Historical Society employee. Mark, I lost track of my time. I can stop whenever, or I can keep going.
I'll give you 7 minutes.
7 minutes?
Because at 7 will be a quarter after, then we'll do questions.
Perfect. All right, I think we could get you a little bit to the animal kingdom, or at least start on that. So what we've seen in Kansas, as I alluded to in my the introductory section, is wholesale species replacement in a lot of areas. Replacement of native wildlife with domesticated animals. 1776, Kansas was a land of bison, elk, wolves, deer, and now we're kind of at the point where you see something like a mountain lion. Those reports come up. A moose. I've certainly seen that in recent years, at least in western Kansas. Those are relative rarities. But at the time, 1776, it was a lot of things that we now associate with places like Yellowstone and whatnot. Prairie chickens were far more numerous in 1776 as well. And one of the things we tend to overlook, and I won't have time for today, is aquatic life. And those have taken some of the biggest hits because of the transformation of waterways. Very diverse aquatic life in Kansas's warm water and cool water streams. Shiners, chubs, mussels, all kinds of fish and invertebrates that are now threatened or endangered were quite populous. A lot of those have been replaced by carp and other non-native species. Many insects, such as grasshoppers, were native to the state of Kansas. Others, such as the state insect, the honeybee, were not native to Kansas. Those were imported by European settlers and first introduced to Kansas from the eastern United States sometime in the first half of the 1800s. So, as I mentioned before, horses were reintroduced to Kansas in the 1600s. I'll spare you much more about that, but that simply revolutionized travel, trade, warfare, and it really begins, might seem primitive to us today with our highly connected world with all these things, but horses really made people, for better or for worse, closer to one another. It shortened distances, certainly not on the scale of, planes, trains, and automobiles, but it was something that enabled faster and a higher volume of trade, more raiding and warfare, and wider ranging hunting for bison and other game. More than 86,000 species of insects are native to North America. About 15,000 of those are found in Kansas. That includes over 190 butterfly species and 120 species of dragonflies. So we had 1874. It certainly happened before, but this was the first big documented one, was this invasion of Rocky Mountain locusts. This plague of grasshoppers swept the state, chewing everything, from the clothes literally off people's backs, eating the wooden tool handles, all of that stuff. Maybe not on that same scale as it happened in 1874, but about 100 years earlier, one has to imagine that grasshoppers had something of an impact on the state. Elk were once abundant in Kansas, but eradicated over time before they were reintroduced to parts of the state during the 1980s. Wolves, and you see a wolf hunt here from 1920s in Norton County. Wolves were eradicated from the state by 1940. And while they've been reintroduced elsewhere, I'm not sure Kansans will be in a hurry to bring wolves back, at least intentionally. The interesting thing is I talk about all these things that have suffered as a result of the land being transformed to farmland and cattle land and all that sort of stuff. But the interesting thing is that with plowing and the loss of prairies, especially tall grass prairies, prairie dog range has actually increased in Kansas. Prairie dog range is historically limited by tall, dense grass growth, but heavy livestock grazing changed grasslands to benefit prairie dogs. Maybe not specifically to benefit, but they did. So I'm going to jump to my final slide here, skip some good stuff. But so I taught for 10 years before I went to the Historical Society, so I learned to be quick on my feet and pivoting to basically plan more than I needed to for a class session and just be ready to be like, all right, that's where I got to cut it there. So, and that is fine because I'd rather have too much material than not enough. So, as we've seen here, Kansas has changed a lot since 1776. Little Ice Age was followed by warmer, drier conditions. Much wildlife was reduced, some eradicated. A lot of domesticated species in particular have been introduced. Waterways transformed. Didn't really get to this, but there's been a lot of damming of moving waters, turning those into reservoirs. There's more trees, less native grasslands. Many native cultures have come and gone, and just a few remain. Change before 1776 was considerable. There was millions of years of climate change. Many animal species came and went without the effects of people. Indigenous burning practices affected grasslands, and I didn't get to talk about beavers, but they affected waterways by damming streams. Kansas, the bottom line was a truly dynamic landscape. Human activities and natural processes brought tremendous changes to the region, only a fraction of which we know about in much depth. Kansas was, in short, not a land waiting for something to happen. As the founding fathers forged a new nation 1,000 miles away. For Kansas, the changes that followed the events of 1776 marked but a new chapter in the region's long history. I appreciate your attention.
Q&A? Yeah. Does anybody have any questions?
I do.
Sure, I'll do the best I can answer to answer
What was
those.
the population of non-Native Americans in 1776?
I mean, I can do the mic if that helps. So the population of Kansas non-natives, I mean, you're probably literally talking dozens of people. And probably dozens of people, yeah. I would imagine, just kind of fur traders mostly visiting on a seasonal basis coming up the Missouri. No documented, there's no archaeologically documented presence in 1776 specifically. Question.
When you talk about the village, the Republican, are you talking about the Republican River?
Yes. The Republican.
And I got another question.
Sure.
When did grizzly bears leave Kansas? Because Lewis and Clark, the first mention of a grizzly bear was a great brown bear with a grizzled mane right here when they were at Leavenworth.
Yeah. So the question is, were there
many?
Many. I haven't seen it. Again, my relatively limited research doesn't suggest that it was overrun with grizzly bears. I think there was some presence, but the scale that you get further west or further up the Missouri, probably not on that level, but certainly some presence. So I don't know. Speak to abundance. That would be one thing I would like to know, but
That's probably just a little corner of Kansas with woods.
yeah, I mean, one has to imagine. The thing with grizzly bears is their population density as a top-level predator to some degree regulates their abundance. And so, I mean, even if you're talking about a lot of bears, and I mean, you talk about, so many bears in Montana now, and they're talking about hunting them and things like that. Your population is, you're talking hundreds. So, yeah, it's sure. Could there have been conservatively dozens of grizzly bears in northeastern Kansas, 1776? Sure.
Any other questions? Dr. Hodge. Thank you. Dr. Hodge. Come back.
I keep trying to get away.
I know.
I don't
Jerry,
worry.
you want to take a picture?
Oh, I'm
We're going to give you this certificate of appreciation. We appreciate you coming in and speaking to us. And pose for the camera.
There you go.
And we have a annual Patriot Muster that we hold in December. We'd like to invite you back for that. So we'll give you the details.
That's for the details. You said in December?
Mhm.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for being here.